Welcome to Man in America, a voice of reason in a world gone mad. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. One of my greatest concerns of the future is not necessarily a communist overthrow here in America, though I think we're kind of well past that, unfortunately, but it's actually something that people refer to as a technocratic state or technocracy, basically meaning that we, the people, will be ruled by technology and that we will be put into some sort of digital prison, similar to what's happening in China right now, where you have social credit scores, monitoring of everything, and where we really give up all of our freedoms to some sort of invisible AI, massive data gathering operation that is controlling every aspect of our lives, right? In my opinion, it goes against the ideals that our country was founded upon, namely the Constitution. So the news right now, though, is about this company called Palantir. Now, I'll be getting into a lot of the details behind Palantir and Peter Thiel in my interview today with Dr. David Martin, but I want to just highlight a little bit about what recently happened and why it's caused so much of an outroar. So here is an article I'll bring up. This is on Zero Hedge, talking about basically the Trump admin tasks Palantir with expanding U.S. surveillance state. So it says the specter of artificial intelligence has cast its shadow over humanity, haunting it with nightmares of a dystopian hellscape under the oppression of a technocratic elite, which may be too formidable to ever defeat. It continues down here. It says, with the near certainty that AI integration will inevitably strengthen the iron-fisted grip government has over its people, the end game of that technocratic revolution ultimately looks as if it will arrive at tyranny. The weight of that proverbial sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of Americans has become ever more apparent following a New York Times report that the Trump administration has tapped Palantir Technologies to use its AI platforms to facilitate the integration of databases across disparate federal agencies. In doing so, the federal government is poised to build a national database capable of wielding unparalleled surveillance powers over American citizens. So that sums up relatively well, basically, that, as I understand it, that Palantir will be building some sort of centralized database using AI to pull in all the different data points of the American people, you and I. We're talking bank accounts, tax history, social media. It's really a digital system for tracking everything about us, as far as I can understand. And there's been, rightfully so, a lot of uproar about this. And this particular image right here is the one that has been shared. You see it everywhere on X right now. Trump taps Palantir to create a master database on every American. Now, this brings up a lot of questions. Is this, is there any potential this is going to be used for good things? Or is this purely something we should be frightened of? What is the end goal of this? How does this tie into the Trump's goals of restoring the founding values of America? How does it relate to big tech and Silicon Valley? And so my guest today, Dr. David Martin, and I, we're going to be diving deep into what is Palantir, how does it tie into the alphabet agencies, looking at Silicon Valley even, which is going to be some mind-blowing information about going back into the origins of Silicon Valley and asking the question, well, is Silicon Valley a front for dark military operations? Are people like Mark Zuckerberg or any number of these kind of famous tech people that create these magnificent technologies in their garages, are they just kind of front people for government technologies being built to surveil and ultimately control us? Now, in addition to talking about Palantir and the surveillance state and everything surrounding that, we're also going to be highlighting a very disturbing report that ties into all this. So I'll go ahead and pull it up for you. And again, we'll be going to it in detail in today's show. So here's the file. It's the National Blueprint for Biodefense. So if you remember going into COVID, when COVID first happened, and then Event 201, there's a lot of discussion, especially among the kind of more truth channels, talking about Event 201, which is a simulation of what happened if a COVID virus, hit America, hit the whole world, what would happen. And it was really this giant wargaming scenario for what would happen. And we saw that it actually played out. Well, so this is frightening. So David Martin, who uses technology to scour the internet and search for things like this, has been the first person I've seen bring this to light. And this report goes into a biological attack happening on July 4th in 2025, so about a month from now, that basically kicks off, it talks about killing a couple 100,000 Americans and how this is the beginning of this massive disease and spread that's, wiping out livestock. And it's a pretty frightening scenario. And so what David and I will be kind of talking about today is merging the ideas and the concepts behind big tech, Silicon Valley, government ties, technocracy, how that ties into Palantir, what's happening under Trump, the mRNA platform, and how that then ties into the potential of this event, right? This scenario where we're going to have another health scare. We're already seeing it too. We're seeing now discussions of a new COVID strain coming from China, and health officials are recommending masking. And so it's just this question of like, is this a Plandemic 2.0 that we're entering into? What do we do about it? Who's behind it? And so much more. And so if you're familiar with Dr. David Martin, he's someone that brings receipts. And what he's going to do is help us just sort through all this information and paint the picture of what's really going on, but also help us to understand what we can do to escape it and how we can actually rise above it as humans created in God's image. So this is going to be a pretty important conversation. If you're watching or listening, I recommend, if you feel compelled to share this with your friends and family, because as David will point out in our discussion, the more people that know about this, the more power we have to not make it happen. So we have to get this information out, which is why I'm doing this show. So just a few quick notes before we jump in, though. If you're watching on Rumble or any platform where you can actually like a video, please do so. Hit the thumbs up or the like button. It helps us to reach more people. Also want to remind you that every show that I do is done as a podcast as well. So if you like to listen instead of watch, just go to your favorite podcast app like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, search for Man in America, and you can listen to the show on there. All right, let's go ahead and dive right into this interview with Dr. David Martin. Dr. David Martin, it is such a pleasure to have you back on the show. It's been too long since we did a show together.
Seth, for some reason, every time we do, we seem to touch the lives of at least 1 million or so people. So here we go again.
Yeah, you're right.
This one is of particular and noteworthy interest. So thank you for having me back. I always am honored to spend time with you. I do think that the nature of our conversations brings out some of the best of humanity. I think, I've had some wonderful people like Patrick Gentempo and a few others, Mickey Willis, who have the space and the capacity to hold open a broad conversation. And I find my conversations with you to be absolutely delightful. I leave them feeling better about life. So there you go.
Well, good. Well, even though we're hitting on some pretty dark topics today, I'm sure that towards the end we're going to round it out so that for people that are watching, right, it's like just stick through it, right? It's like the movie where everything goes wrong, but the very end, the hero's journey, there's something positive. So we got to stick to the course.
We even redefine what the hero's journey is. So
there we go.
Let's do it.
So it's interesting because we've been going back and forth with our schedules for quite some time, and I didn't pick this particular date for the interview based upon, hey, something big happened in the news and I want to get you to come on and talk about it. It just so happens that we coincide with a few big things happening right now. One of which is the recent announcement about Palantir, which you know all too much about. And then the other is I'll pull it up, which we'll get into, the National Blueprint for Biodefense, talking, basically it's an Event 201 scenario about some sort of biological attack on July 4th of 2025. So this is something that is literally a month away, which is obviously important for us to talk about. So I'll hand it to you, and wherever you want to start, I'll just follow.
Well, in my book, Coup de 12, Seth, I talk about a business plan / social engineering exercise, which is referred to as disruption. And the reason I talk about disruption is because that pays homage to the framework that was adopted many, many years ago by a group of people who decided that they wanted, through commercial and subterfuge interests, to find a way to dislodge what we think of as democratic systems, what we think of as democracies, liberties, civil liberties, and so forth. And the idea was to create a series of event horizons that was modified off of the book that was written by Lee Clow. Many people don't know, but Lee Clow, who was the significant influence behind the marketing and advertising agency Chiat Day, which was and still remains, I believe, and it certainly was for a long time, the market face, the front door of Apple. Lee Clow and Steve Jobs had come up with this idea of disruption as an approach that would allow people to achieve large-scale social transformation where, by virtue of very subtle imaging, you could get the public to embrace a thing which was inherently dissonant with the ideas that were being discussed. But they did it in a very cunning way. If you think about something as simple as the case example of this, the iPhone or the iPod or the iPad, ironically, was built around creating a consensus illusion where everybody was losing their identity. It's funny that they actually had the I as a little I. So they were taking this sense of identity and putting it into, you're missing out if you're not exactly like everybody else. Think about how funny and ironic and tragic it is that you have.
I'll put it real quickly. Sorry. This is for people who don't know Lee Clow, which I used to be and do a lot of work in advertising. I went to in design school. He was one of like the legends of design, and he was one of the people. He was the driver behind. If you'll remember, these were the original iPod ads. What's interesting though is that they were just a silhouette. It was a faceless person.
Yes,
doing this, right? These original ads.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to add that.
The whole point was to create this impulse that says, I have to have what is going to erase the I. I mean, it's somewhat funny. It's almost the devil's proposition to Jesus. If you just bow the knee, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. But you forget that if you bow the knee, you're no longer you. So, but anyhow, Lee Clow was very instrumental in this, by the way. And so credit where credit is due. Lee Clow was part of this campaign and very famously, most people don't know, but he was instrumental in picking what would become President Obama through a series of marketing tests where hope and change posters included the faces and likenesses of many, many, many different candidates. And through market tests, President Obama was ultimately selected as the most electable canvas upon which others could paint and others could influence. But that work that is almost an homage to an Andy Warhol-like look had, back in the pre-Obama voting era, had a number of different possible faces that were going to be run. And so it's fascinating, as I mentioned in the book, Peter Thiel was front and center in all of those efforts. And the character that he plays in this entire exercise is a character that understands what was originally done, and this goes back in history, what was originally done by a series of life insurance companies like Swiss Re and Munich Re and others, who had been collecting vast amounts of data. And if you think about this, Seth, most people don't understand what we currently are supposed to fear as this modern usurpation of our individual identity is actually what the life insurance companies have been doing since life insurance. What they're doing is tracking behaviors, they're tracking patterns, they're tracking individual information, they're tracking things like health records. I mean, how many people before a life insurance policy wound up having to do a physical? And where do you think that data went? That went to these vaults of information, largely in Zurich and other parts of Switzerland and in Bermuda, where people would sit and analyze the life profiles and ultimately death profiles and death actuarial plans for a vast number of people. And so we're talking about it now because there's a currency to this conversation. But this has been going on for over 25 years, where large data, largely around personal profiles of how people live, how they interact, how they both, either support their life or recklessly endanger their life, all this kind of stuff has been collected for a long time. And there once upon a time was a company called SAIC.
Tax day may have passed, but for millions of Americans, the real trouble is just beginning. If you missed the April 15th deadline, or if you still owe back taxes, the IRS is ramping up enforcement. Every day you wait, it only makes things worse. With over 5,000 new tax liens filed daily and tools like property seizures, bank levies, and wage garnishments, the IRS is applying pressure at levels we haven't seen in years. Increased administrative scrutiny means collections are moving fast. The good news, there's still time for Tax Network USA to help. Are you self-employed or a business owner? Even if your books are a mess, they've got it covered. Tax Network USA specializes in cleaning up financial chaos and getting you back on track fast. Even after the deadline, it's not too late to regain control. Your consultation is completely free, and acting now could stop penalties, threatening letters, and surprise levies before they escalate. Call 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/MIA. You may have missed April 15th, but you haven't run out of options. Let Tax Network USA help before the IRS makes the next move. Again, that's 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/MIA.
SAIC, for those of you who don't know, created things like the Chexus system, Huntington Bank shares, that had the ability to track every single check cashed between every single party. Did you hear what I just said? And this, by the way, years before anybody knew that this was happening. They also had a system called Sabre. And Sabre was the uniform program that allowed for people to track every airplane ticket that someone purchased, every hotel stay, all of the information, which before we had things like Airbnb and before we had things like Travelocity, Sabre was this unifying data source that tracked the movement of everyone on the planet. And these are all things, Seth, that are 20 plus years old. And the vast majority of people sit there going, oh, no, this is a new thing. AI is doing this. Computers are doing this. No, this has been going on for a long time. And in my book, I lay out all of the reasons why this was so critical. But the idea was that we need to get the human race to stop seeing itself as sovereign. We need to take this beautiful manifestation of life called humanity, and we need to crunch it down into a very small packet of consumption to extinction oriented events. You are not a person. You are a consumer until you die. And the life insurance, the SAICs of the world, the banking systems of the world, all of these systems were built to build a massive network information set, which would then be used to train information. And giant surprise, companies like Oracle, founded by Larry Ellison, but most people don't know that that came out of the classified CIA project, which was also called Oracle at the Ampex Corporation. People don't know that Oracle, every database that was ever built, was a front door data harvesting mechanism for the back door of figuring out the map of humanity. And just like we saw with SAIC, just like we saw with Oracle, Palantir, a company that very, very, very few people have ever really examined. And that in part because Peter Thiel, as a phenomenal operator, is a savant when it comes to intellect. He is truly a remarkable mind. And kind of like Elon Musk, only much more private, much more measured, Peter Thiel is savant to the level of expediency. And what that means in my definition is that in the interest of what makes sense to him, he becomes on the edge of amoral. and I am very precise to say amoral, not immoral. And we can argue whether the things he's doing is immoral. I'm not making that argument right now. I'm saying that expediency becomes the only thing that matters. And so, giant surprise to all the people who were wildly enthusiastic about Trump being elected, what you didn't see was the size of the checks Peter Thiel wrote, not only to get Trump elected, but to make J.D. Vance in the first place. J.D. Vance is an unknown, and he is a canvas of Peter Thiel's. He was paid for by Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel was extremely motivated around making him the phenomenon that he was in politics. And lo and behold, when it came time to pick a vice president, I can assure you, Donald Trump did not make that choice. He didn't. He was handed who the vice president was going to be. So is it a wonder that during COVID, the company that was behind so many of the surveillance programs and the company that was behind so many of the monitoring systems to figure out whether people were going to take the shot or were going to comply with orders or were going to do any of those things, behind those were, that's right, Palantir, government contracts left, right, and center. And then is it any surprise that since Trump has taken office, Palantir has received more government contracts than probably by growth anybody else in terms of any particular industry player. Now, we can sit here and pretend like all of that just happens to be coincident. But here comes the problem. This was an architecture set in motion back in 1998. You heard the date correctly.
98.
98.
Well, one thing I'll throw out just quickly in terms of date is as I pulled up, I didn't quickly see, you may not have seen it, but this right here is a CIA document. This will go back to 1975 for Project Oracle, where it discusses the obviously some of it is redacted, but the design of the Oracle mass storage system. Storage control processors through transport. Basically, you can see it's a massive tech project for storing and harvesting data, and this is 1975.
Yeah, this is why I always love for when people tell me that the Silicon Valley phenomenon was somehow this brilliant bunch of guys sitting in garages. Nothing could be more nonsensical and distant from truth. This was covert operations that were masked under the guise, in the case of Ampex Corporation, to do a number of things, which were social behavior monitoring. Most people don't know that the Ampex Corporation also was the inventor, allegedly, of Dolby surround sound. Now, everybody loves to have Dolby surround sound in their house, but very few people understand that that was an acoustic program for behavior modification. Just sit with that for a second.
So Dolby, right? Like I've got Dolby, Dolby 5.1, 6.1.
Yeah, there you go.
So that was run by Ampex, right? Data, which is a Data Systems Corporation. So you're saying that Dolby was part of a behavior modification program. It wasn't just, hey, let's build a great sound system for the IMAX theaters.
No. Ampex Corporation was Operation Paperclip's recipient. A.M. Pontioff was the guy who harvested all of the German engineers as the reprisals for the Second World War. Ampex Corporation has always been a front for dark ops that were social engineering dark ops and surveillance and all this kind of stuff. So giant shock that you have a behavior modification acoustic system, which is in everybody's home, so that's right. We can have our minds altered by virtue of the sound that we have, both explicitly and, more importantly, the implicit frequencies in those sounds. And if you go back and look at the early Ampex engineering, you see that most of them come out of covert ops for mind control. So there's those little tiny details that people don't like to talk about. And the reason we need to go into this history, Seth, is the baton handoff between these covert operators is seamless, because no one bothers to point this out. We don't bother to look. When we get a Dolby surround sound system, we celebrate it. We go, oh my gosh, great sound. And it feels like I'm in the theater where I'm feeling the vibration of the jet engines when I play Top Gun. Well, you are feeling that. And you're also getting a lot of other stuff. But what we're not understanding is this disruption Remember, this is the Steve Jobs phenom that has truly ruled the world for the last 2 decades. If you go back and look at all of that stuff and you go back and ask the question, what was going on with Steve Jobs and Robert Friedland? The name nobody talks about. Robert Friedland, also known as Toxic Bob in some headlines, one of the greatest conflict metals proliferators on the planet. Why were they together at an ashram in India? Why were they doing the things that they were doing, which ultimately gave rise to the preeminence of Apple? These questions are questions we don't even bother asking, and we sit there pretending like an event horizon, like what is being proposed for July 4th, 2025, is a giant surprise. The answer is it's not a surprise. It's not even remotely interesting from the standpoint of this is yet another time when the public has been hypnotized into this comatose state of believing, yeah, we had the COVID thing. I'm sure we're done with that. They're not going to do that again. Well, remember they did it with anthrax in 2001? And we didn't learn. And then they did it with bird flu. And then they did it with MERS. And then they did it with, oh, that's right, SARS 2.0. And here's the problem. The problem is people think that SARS is now and COVID is now kind of this thing of the past. But here comes the little nasty secret. If you go back to Austrian philosopher von Hayek, who made a very important observation that the abuse of public health as a means of terrifying a population becomes a principal agency of suspending liberties that ultimately never are recovered. So this is you create a little inch of the problem and you take a mile, and then you create another inch and you take another mile. And while they are going to tell us that we're not social distancing, so things are better now, and we're not masking, so things are better now, the fact of the matter is every one of these things is a power grab. Every one of these things is an ability to suppress liberty more and more and more. And we sit back in this stunned mullet silence of going, clearly they're not going to do it again. Well, bad news for everybody. Tom Ridge, that's right, the Secretary of Homeland Security, when it was first established under the Bush administration, collaborated with a group of people to come up with a scenario in which they are calling for, and listen carefully to what I'm going to say, the death of 280,000 Americans on July 4th, 2025. In 1 month from today, there is a plan that involves the murder of 280,000 Americans on a single day. And the best part of it is they're going to blame a foreign actor for it, except for a tiny little problem. Yeah, if you hop down to page 9 of that National Blueprint for Biodefense, Seth, and highlight the first major paragraph under the U.S. House of Representatives, let's go ahead, for the sake of everybody on here, make sure that we read it. We were attacked, and we don't know who did the attack. But the infectious agent they used killed 280,000 Americans and infected at least 400,000 throughout the country on a single day, in addition to 200,000 dead and 800,000 sickened animals. Now, if you scroll up for a moment, Seth, and keep going until I tell you to stop, just keep scrolling. Scroll up, scroll up, scroll up. What you're going to find when you get to this page, oh, there you go. Look at ex officio members. If you look at the ex officio members of this particular committee, there are 2 names that I want to call your attention to. Gerald W. Parker and George Post. Those names are names that people should be familiar with, but they are not. These are veterinary scientists and gain-of-function scientists who have done an enormous amount of work in a variety of pathogens. George Post famously was very much involved in the Arizona contribution to the gain-of-function research that brought us COVID-19 and all of those kinds of things. And here we have the same actors. In this case, we have the ability to go into their research and find out what kind of pathogen would go after humans and animals on the same day. How do we figure out what that is? And it turns out that there are a bunch of options. Nipah virus is what they refer to in this scenario, but equine encephalitis, which is a huge gain of function problem, is something that these guys have been familiar with. And there are several other pathogens that these guys have been working with. And the fact is that they're telling us that on July 4th, on the celebration of the 249th year of America in its formation, we are going to allegedly have a biological weapons attack. And do you realize, Seth, that not a single person in law enforcement, not a single person in the White House, not Bobby Kennedy at HHS, not a Tulsi Gabbard at the DNI, not a single person is actually taking an action to interdict the actors that I'm talking about. This is not a problem that happened during the Biden non-presidency. This is a thing that is a statement of intent to once again take advantage of human dynamics. So, where we are going to appeal to fear, we are going to appeal to this notion that somebody out there attacked us, where we know already who the actors are. We have a high probability of knowing what they're going to say the pathogen was. And remember, these are not pathogens. These are weapons deployed against humanity. And as I've said many times, we can go back and look at the likely delivery mechanisms, which are rocket-propelled grenades that have blast-resistant pathogen concussive devices that allow a pathogen to be spread over a stadium, over a park, over any one of a mass gathering event, where you wouldn't know the difference between a firework going off and a pathogen ballistic device spreading toxins across a crowd. In fact, if I were going to do it, I would actually do it during the fireworks celebrations. So we know that this is actually a fully planned, fully baked, like you said, Event 201 kind of thing. And yours truly is the only one that started talking about it. And unfortunately, now this is the third show where there's been a conversation about this particular topic.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack here. I'm going to bookmark the discussion I want to have shortly about big tech and Silicon Valley, because that's a whole can of worms. That's a Pandora's box, right? But just focusing on that, I'll pull this document. So basically, this document right here is similar to Event 201, was a scenario, right, where they overwent, they did a kind of wargaming scenario of this biological attack. Now, I just want to read that particular paragraph, because now that you mentioned that the pathogens could be spread, that they're blast resistant, so you could have a firework that's preloaded with pathogens that would be released to a large crowd gathering. I just want to look at this really quickly and just read this particular paragraph, which you highlighted earlier. The chair says, I call this first hearing of the joint inquiry to order. 9 weeks ago, some nation or terrorist group, we still don't know who, attacked the nation's capital and other U.S. cities with biological weapons as we celebrated Independence Day. The infectious agent they used killed at least 280,000 Americans and infected at least 400,000 throughout the country in a single day, in addition to the 200,000 dead and 800,000 sickened animals. These numbers will increase as the disease spreads. Many of our own colleagues and staff here in Congress fell ill and died. Coordinated attacks in allied nations in the days that followed killed tens of thousands more. So, and continue actually, so we are now hearing that the terrorists conducted smaller scale attacks in American cities and localities prior to the July 4th incidents to test our defense and gauge our responses. These smaller scale attacks went largely unnoticed. Laboratory tests confirmed that Nipah virus caused the disease, but we still do not know what methods our adversaries use to infect humans, et cetera, et cetera. So this is like, if we could go back in time before COVID hit, and you and I could sit down at that Event 201 scenario meeting, which I've played on shows over and over again, and we said, wait, this is actually going to happen.
Yeah.
How did you come across this? Because I only heard about this thing through you, I saw the Shannon Joy interview that you did.
Yep.
But it's not something everyone's talking about. It's not like there was a big
nobody's
breaking.
Talking about it. No one has talked about it.
How did you find this? How did you become aware of this?
It's like everything else, Seth. I have machines that scour the universe for interesting information. And when I saw George Post's name, because he's somebody I flagged a long time ago as somebody of great interest, and I have his work going back to the early 2000s and a bunch of my gain of function triggers that I have on my systems. When you have the Secretary of Homeland Security as a member of the Planning Committee, and you have George Post as a member of the Planning Committee, there is an alarm bell that I have that my system set off. And this happens to be one of those things where, to be perfectly blunt, when I first looked at the scenario, I failed to see that it was talking about a forward event horizon called July 4th, 2025. And when you do a simple little numerology reduction on that, you get 9/11. And that's where the machine intelligence that I have added to the just human curiosity that I have kind of coalesced. And I thought, oh, you know what? This is a mirror of 9/11. They're doing another one of their little plans. And once again, I've said many times, having this conversation lessens the likelihood that it happens. If we had had these conversations in ahead of Event 201, COVID would be unlikely to have happened. But the problem is nobody was interested in having these conversations. And despite the multiple times since 2002 and 3 where I started briefing these issues, the public was not even interested in hearing them. So we're in a different phase. And in many respects, we are in a much more hopeful phase right now. Because as your listeners share this content, what happens is we decrease the risk of this happening, because literally speaking about it pushes the likelihood of the event down. There was a recent interview that made it onto social media about a hearing where, in a congressional hearing, there was a discussion about the appropriateness of putting vaccines into edible vegetables. And people were losing their mind. And I got tons of people sending me the video of, did you see this guy saying that they have vaccines in vegetables? Well, it turns out that in 2005, when I was in Tehran, Iran, and I met the head of the bioengineering program from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, he was celebrating at that event the fact that they had successfully put vaccines into tomato plants so that you could get a tomato at the grocery store and you would be eating a vaccine. They have been doing that with the mosaic virus on tobacco for a very long time, and tobacco has been a very effective vector to manifest all kinds of vaccination-oriented technologies. But tomatoes as a broadleaf plant are susceptible, once again, to a mosaic virus construct, and that mosaic virus construct lets the tomato plant produce a vaccine. Now, I don't know how many of you realize that there is no current legal standard in the United States prohibiting even a Whole Foods that allegedly has organic produce. There's nothing that says that they can't put a vaccine into your salad. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I know that the reason why Kim and I love to have our own garden, because I like to know that the only thing that's infecting our salad is a lot of sunlight. In our case, a lot of alpaca poo, which is very good because we have a neighbor that has a lot of alpacas. And it turns out that, we like to know what's in our food. We don't like to have the Darwin's grab bag of any genetically modified anything that goes into our body. And so last night, my salad did not have a vaccine in it. Because I picked it out of the garden and had to compete with the deer to get it. But the point is that we're in a situation right now where the incredulity that most people have where they go, well, clearly they're not going to do that again, or clearly they're not going to do that. Well, the answer is not only are they going to do it, and once again, they have names. They do have names like Tom Ridge, like George Post, like the people in this particular document. And they do have names like the participants in Event 201. And they do have names like the patent holders on blast-resistant pathogen dispersal agents at the United States Army. Seth, do you think that a blast-resistant pathogen distribution agent, does that sound like public health? Does that sound like DARPA's just trying to make sure that we are safe as a population? Or does it sound, when you say a blast-resistant munition, does that sound like a weapon?
It sounds like a weapon. Like, yeah, so well, is that this right here?
That's what it is.
This is one example, perhaps, a novel blast-resistant gene.
Yeah.
What's interesting here, it looks like this was developed in China. If you look at all the names on there.
But if you look at all of this stuff and you go down in any level of detail, you're going to find a U.S. funding source.
You'll find a Battelle lab, and right. So
it's disgusting. It's turtles all the way down.
I got a million questions. I'm going to try my best to focus them. So if we're looking at Silicon Valley, like kind of tying this all together, I've done some deep dives into the history of Google, Facebook, Twitter. I've on my own, come to the conclusion, similar to what you've talked about, that these were basically DARPA. These were military budget operations that had some face to them. This Mark Zuckerberg, this guy who built this in a garage, right? That whole story of the unicorn company that becomes the the $1 trillion global social media company. So basically, kind of tying us all together, so much of what we've seen in Silicon Valley is just they're just disguised, it's lipstick on a pig, and what the pig is military black budget population control mechanisms, data harvesting, mass, like Edward Bernays would be like just doing backflips in his grave to see what kind of social engineering could be done with the modern technology.
Absolutely. You're exactly right.
So that you had this, big tech, right, in Silicon Valley, which is really a front for CIA, DARPA, I'm sure that Mossad, Israeli intelligence, all these coming into that. So then when Trump gets back in, you have all of a sudden all of these major big tech CEOs, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, the list goes on, Peter Thiel, that have all of a sudden now backed Trump, huge donations, et cetera. You've got JD Vance with massive ties, obviously, to Palantir, to Peter Thiel. So as we're then heading into this July 4th scenario with a lot of these same actors, you mentioned that the numerology points to a similar, actually the identical numerology of 9/11, right?
Yep.
And tying that together. Now, 9/11, in my humble opinion, was a false flag to bring in the Patriot Act. This massive pre-written bill that was just waiting for the right opportunity to say, oh, here we go. Here goes all your civil liberties. Constitution, what's that, right? So that was 9/11. So do you think, kind of putting everything together, you have the recent announcements of the funding for these Palantir databases with the Trump administration. You have Larry Ellison and Sam Altman coming out like on day 2 or 3 of Trump's presidency announcing Project Stargate, right? It's $500 billion
self-amplifying mRNA and
yes. And so do you think that what's kind of behind this closed wall is this massive surveillance system, massive population control, technocracy in its truest sense? And of course, you've got Elon, right? The guy who's putting chips in people's heads, and everyone loves him because he wears a MAGA hat and talks about the Constitution. But if you look at the technology he's building, I don't trust anybody who's building, brain chips and all these things. I think, to me, represent the evolution as seen by man, which is man merging with machine to become God and not this God. So do you think that, how does that tie into this July 4th? When you look at it all, do you see this massive, elaborate plan that spans decades leading us into technocracy?
Yeah, and we need to be very clear on the fact that we decided a long time ago as society we decided that the extended life lithium battery that makes our back then Walkman play longer was worth the life of lithium miners in South America who had an average life expectancy of half of a normal person's life. Do you hear the comedy and the irony in that? Extended life batteries only cut the lives of the humans in half. But we didn't care about that because we wanted to be able to listen to, I don't know, Shania Twain, or we needed to hear, somebody croon more on our Walkmans and more on our radios back then than we cared about.
Gold has surged 46% in less than a year, doubling the gains of the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. But this isn't just another rally. Global reserves are shifting, exposing cracks in the monetary system. Investors are losing confidence in paper gold and demanding physical metal, creating a massive gap between gold owed and gold available. But this isn't about how institutions broke another system. It's about how you can profit from it. Right now, Noble Gold Investments has a limited supply of investment-grade gold bars and coins available. As banks scramble to fulfill their obligations, pushing gold prices higher, you can profit. Smart investors are already moving into physical gold. Noble Gold Investments makes it easy for you to do the same. And right now, when you make a qualified investment, Noble Gold will add a free 10th ounce gold coin to your order. Don't wait until it's too late. Visit goldwithseth.com or call 626-654-1906 now and turn their panic into your profit. Again, that's goldwithseth.com or 626-654-1906. You'll find that information in the description for the show as well. So looking at the lithium battery example, right? It's just this example where we've said, oh, okay, well, I can now listen to Nirvana for 6 hours straight, while someone's now living to 30 years old on average instead of 60, and down in Brazil or wherever they're mining this. And I think that's kind of highlight the reason you brought that example, that as I see is it highlights this bigger picture of complacency. And here in America, we'll trade almost anything for comfort and security. And
right. And this is where I think we have the challenge with these scenarios. When we have a tabletop exercise that assumes that the public will fall again for the same charade that's been what it falls for, ever since we were told to fear nuclear fallout by hiding under incineratable school desks, right? How ludicrous it was to do a duck and cover drill. But what did it do? It habituated this idea that someone somewhere out there, some tech wizard, some defense wizard knows better than we do. And our little minds, when we were 8 or 9 or 10 and we were told to hide under the desk to prepare for the Russians bombing us, became hypnotized into believing that there was a government that was looking out for us, and somehow or another that government was our savior, and all we had to do was crawl under a desk and be compliant, and then suddenly we'd be fine. Well, what we don't understand is that the epigenetic effect, and I literally mean epigenetics here, the epigenetic fear of normalizing a external authority that tells you to be afraid, then it tells you to deprive yourself of logic, right? Any one of us could have examined how dumb the idea of there's a nuclear strike and we're supposed to hide under a desk. Really? Like, that is laughable. But we still somehow were able to be coerced into something that on its face was nonsensical and at its heart was insidious, because what it was doing was conditioning us to expect a expert telling us what to do, and without any consideration, we just fall into line. And so whether that's for our benefit, where we're told, well, we're going to have social media, we'll use a term, which, by the way, is the most antisocial thing we've ever invented, but we call it social media. So we hypnotize ourselves, no different from when we use the term vaccine to allegedly help prevent a disease. but it's the thing that's actually perpetrating the death and destruction. But we call it a thing, and it's exactly the opposite of it. And I think, Seth, we've been doing this what I refer to in my blog is inverted alchemy for a long time. What we're doing is we're taking this idea that humans respond to fear, and they respond to demands for acquiescence, and they respond to these hideous impulses. And they're so predictable that they can be told there's going to be an attack on July 4th. And we don't even blink an eye. We don't even hold on a minute. How could we callously say 280,000 Americans lose their lives and that's acceptable? So that we can, promote a law that wants to have total invasion of our privacy, total invasion of our personal space, total surrender of the sovereignty of our own information, our own communications. And by the way, that's exactly what this kind of an event horizon would do. And if you go back and look at who was the person called into being the SWAT team to investigate this thing, it's the Department of State and the Department of Defense. You know what's not mentioned? The Department of Health and Human Services. In this scenario, the respondents are intelligence, defense, and communications. How bizarre for a public health event where we don't even have health referenced in the first response.
It's like it's just a military operation.
It is a military operation because it's not like a military operation. It is a military operation, just like COVID and Operation Warp Speed were. So, are there lessons to learn? No question. But it comes to that deeper question, which is the question that you and I have explored many times. And, ironically, one of the things I'm doing in a couple months, because I fully intend, by the way, to survive July 4th. I fully intend to be on my farm having a beautiful time on July 4th. But, a number of us, in fact, this started with a conversation on my farm with Joel Salatin, who is a phenomenal visionary in terms of the potential of the human agroeconomic and agronomical kind of future. Joel came out and he was doing a review of my farm and seeing how Kim and I could turn it into kind of its own little Eden, which we're doing in slow motion. And he said, wouldn't it be fun to put together an event that didn't talk about the problems, but talked about solutions? And so what we're doing is realizing that if we don't change the narrative and start talking about how humans can rise to their full vitality and to their full potential, and to see the limitless and boundless nature of their wonder, we're part of the problem. So what we're doing, Rejuvenate Health Summit, August 1 and 2 at Polyface Farms in Stanton, Virginia, a number of us are getting together, and what we're going to do is talk not about all the things that are wrong, but we're going to sit with several hundred of the most brilliant people and the most compassionate and loving humanity and talk about how we reintegrate into a world that says that the world is not our enemy. Nature is not creating poisons to kill us. These are all man-made, fear-mongering stories and narratives. And we're going to have an amazing time with amazing people showing that there's a better form of humanity that is not respondent to fear, not respondent to acquiescence, not willing to bend the knee, but to stand tall and say, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We have unbounded potential if we allow ourselves to simply step into humanity. And the beautiful thing is, Seth, by doing the conversation we just had, we decrease the likelihood of the evil having its day, and we increase the likelihood of humanity having that little glimmer, that little tiny ember that's still glowing inside of all of us. And it is in all of us. That ember, if we simply fan it into flame, can reignite a humanity that does not respond to the whims and the willful inhumanity of big tech, of the artificial of artificial intelligence, of all of the things that have been set into motion to hijack and to suspend us from our full potential. And it turns out that that flame can then light the forest fire that then can engulf the world with a light. And that light is the light of life. And that light can surround us. And I can tell you, I am more optimistic sitting here today, recognizing that the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who will watch your show are going to then share this message. And every time somebody hits share, they decrease the likelihood of an adverse event horizon happening and increase the likelihood that humanity will once again stand against the tyranny of darkness.
One thing I oftentimes go back to with this as we're wrapping up, though I wish we had another 3 hours, is if you look at a lot of these people, the technocrats, I would say that there's one thing that's pretty congruent amidst them is that they're atheist, right? The whole idea of merging man and machine is the next. It's this belief in evolution and that the human race evolves through technology and the merger of the flesh and the microchip, basically. But to me, if my enemy is ever an atheist or someone that is or worshiping Lucifer or some other dark entity, it's like we've already won, because we are made in God's image. And if someone doesn't believe in God or believe in the divine spark within all of us, and they think they can become God through technology and through deception and through mass programming and everything, they have underestimated the greatest foe they will ever have. And that is in a lot of ways what gives me hope, is that we're still here. They've been trying to exterminate us for a long time, but we're still here because God needs us here.
Well, and I think, that I've been examining this. If you look at we just passed a couple days ago the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Creed. Most people don't know that, but that's an anniversary we should mark. And the Council of Nicaea, which unfortunately turned our notion of the divine into a creation in man's image, which is actually quite a tragic thing. Constantine was trying to justify an empire, and he was trying to justify his own divine nature, where he was usurping the idea of divinity to be something that is in absolute and unambiguous clarity, that said that he was above all else. And to do that, what he did was he elevated a version of God, which oddly enough at the time, if you go back and look at both the Hebrew tradition and the early Christian tradition, was actually a desecration of the divine. The reason why we were prohibited from having idolatry was because God was too big to put into a form or a name. You weren't supposed to even mention the name of God. Why? Because the minute you shrink it into a form, technology, it ceases to have its unbounded, unlimited space. And so, ironically, 1,700 years ago, we set this particular process in motion. And it is time for all of us to examine, why did we allow God to be defined by man, rather than stepping into a relationship that says, shouldn't we go back and examine what it means to be a loving, caring, compassionate, generative, infinitely unbounded by perspective, divine presence? And what we have done is ironically made God in man's image. And then what the technocracy has done is said, well, if you're already willing to give up on divinity, we'll take it the rest of the way. And so, as I've said in many presentations, and I know there's a lot of people in the evangelical movement that get upset when I say this, but I think that before we actually look at the, kind of the speck in our brother's eye, to use, Christ's terminology, let's look at the plank in our own. Have we sold ourselves, and ultimately have we sold divinity short by putting God in the box that happens to be the thing that we've decided to label? And is it possible that if we lived out a more perfect version of what we are meant to be. We are meant to be salt and light in the earth. We're not supposed to sit there just throwing stones at our neighbors. In fact, we're not supposed to throw stones at our neighbors at all. Maybe we have not done our job in keeping our lamps tended and our wicks trimmed. And maybe because we have failed to do that, we have created a vacuum into which the darkness is more than happy to move. And so my view is simple. Let your light shine. Not wait for somebody else. Let your light shine. What is your light? What is your essence? Let your light shine. It doesn't have to come in the form that somebody told you it had to come in. It has to be the authentic expression of the divine within you. You must let your light shine, because if you do, what does it say? That glorifies your Father. And I think that 1700 years ago, we made a mistake. We decided to not let our light shine. We decided to begin a pathway of saying God is in this box. And you go back to that creed and go, does that capture all of the essence of the divine, or is that something written by an emperor who wanted to then say he was divinely appointed to be emperor? And it turns out that that question becomes a very, very dangerous one to ask, because the answer is very uncomfortable. And so I'm a huge fan of, once again, getting back to the soul and the essence of what it means to be human, what it means to be in this divinely created order. And the minute we do that, I think the technocracy fails, because we realize we don't need anything.
That's it. That's absolutely it. Well, Dave, I know you've got a flight to catch.
I do.
I want to I'll bring up this website one last time. I'll put this link in the description. I'm going to try to be there as well. The opportunity to come to Joel Salatin's farm and hang out with you and Joel Salatin. Exactly. To me, it's just like, how can I not go there? So this is
and Seth, it's important to realize one of the things that I suggested when we organized this is that we're going to do something very unusual. The speakers are usually seconded off in their VIP green rooms and everything else. Because this is at Polyface Farms, because Joel and his team are creating all of the catering for the event, the speakers are actually going to be serving the people who attend. And so this is going to be modeling a model of how humanity ought to run, where the greatest among you is the servant of all. And so I don't know what's on the menu, but I do know that you'll see me, and you'll see Kim, and you'll see Australia's super chef Pete Evans, and you'll see these amazing people, Tanda Cook and Katie Collier and others. You're going to see all these people, Eric Naputi. You're going to see these people who are fabulous human beings doing fabulous work, and so many others. And you're going to not just see them on stage as experts, and you're not going to see them in an elevated position, but each and every one of them has agreed to be the servant of all too. This is going to be a form of humanity that you should at least witness, because as you witness what is possible with humanity, nothing but greatness comes from it.
Well, I'm looking forward to you serving me some goat meatloaf, some regeneratively grown goat meatloaf.
There you go. All right. Well, I'm looking
David,
forward to
thank
that
you
too,
so
Seth.
much. It's such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you, and safe travels.
Always an honor, and thank you so much. It's delightful to spend time with you, and I am looking forward to getting this out to as many people as can hear it, so that we push back the darkness.
That's the goal. Thank you so much, David. Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview, if enjoy is the right word, but I hope that you learned something from it, and perhaps you're even compelled to share it with your friends or family, because we have to get this information out. But I always enjoy how David Martin is able to take a very dark topic like that and then end up on something that gives us hope. And I do have hope. I really, really do, because I've got faith. And I guess if I had no faith, if I was an atheist, I'd have no hope right now. I'd think, okay, the world is screwed. We're going to be living in digital prisons in the next couple of years. There's no future for my kids, but I actually am full of hope, because I do believe that there is that divine spark in all of us, and that divine spark is something that the robots and the technocrats, they can't create that. They can't control it. Now, what's interesting is that just a couple of days ago, I did an interview, a separate interview, talking about digital privacy and how to protect ourselves from the digital surveillance state. I interviewed a guy named Glenn Meter, who is the founder of a company called the Privacy Academy. Now, the timing is perfect because we've actually got next week, we're doing an entire free, this is free, okay? It's a free webinar on how to protect yourself from the digital surveillance state. Now, we had this interview before the Palantir news came out, which is kind of odd timing, but there's going to be a link in the description to this show where you can go on there and register. Again, like I said, it's 100% free. Okay. So it's just to educate people. They've got other things that if you want to continue with other education, there's more options for that. But this is going to be a detailed webinar and Q&A with someone, Glenn, who is an absolute master when it comes to privacy and security in the digital era. So in this webinar, we're talking about how brands like Apple use privacy as a selling point, even though it's not true, how big tech companies like Microsoft and Apple collect data on you at all times with their operating systems, how the new Windows and Apple AI updates are specifically designed to make a profile on you and what you do on your computer, how you can move to Linux-based operating systems without being a tech geek, private alternatives to mainstream apps like Microsoft Word, and again, live Q&A. So if internet privacy and digital privacy is important to you and you don't want to be tracked on everything and have every move you're making and every word you're typing and everything that's happening on your computer being fed into some sort of digital surveillance state will be used against you, I highly, highly recommend you attend this free webinar. So again, it's the date is right here. And if you miss the exact date, you can still have access to the replay of it. But if you're on there for the live webinar, then you're able to then ask questions live and everything like that. So it's going to be next Thursday, June 12th at 11 a.m. Central. That's 12 p.m. Eastern. So again, so it's next Thursday, June 12th at 11 a.m. Central. And so if you want to attend that live, I'll be there in attendance. Glenn and Eric Meter from the Privacy Academy, they're going to be in their attendance. We're going to be covering everything about basically how to stop this digital state from spying on us in every aspect of our lives. So I highly, highly recommend you attend it. Again, it's free. And if you say you're working at that time, you'll still get access to a replay of it. It's going to be so detailed. It's going to be really teaching you the fundamentals of how to basically protect yourself and protect your digital identity, not just from government surveillance, but also from hackers, from scams, etc. So the link for that will be in the description to the show. And also in the next day or two, I've got the full interview coming out with Glenn, where we're going to be talking about kind of deep diving into the entire privacy, online protection, and how to keep ourselves safe. All right. Well, again, thank you for joining me for the interview, and thank you for David Martin giving us this time. And this reminder that if you enjoyed it, please make sure that you share this with your friends or family, because this is a very real threat. As much as I want to think, hey, the world's great, we're entering into the golden age, unfortunately, whether it's the FDA, FDA still rolling out mRNA technology, or the very close relationship with our current government and big tech and the digital surveillance state, these are things that concern me greatly. And so I'm doing everything I can to protect my family. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.